Hello, I'm Laura Southern, and this is my Saga Spaces talk.
Hello there and welcome. I'm Gavin Ramshawn and I'll be your presenter for this afternoon's Saga Spaces talk. Now, Saga Spaces is where you can experience live online talks with some of the most prominent minds and leading thinkers, especially created for you. Every one of our live talks is an opportunity for you to learn something enriching and empowering with practical tips and valuable take-home advice. So we hope your experience today will leave you wanting more. They're also fully interactive as well, so you can ask questions and tell us how you feel with our one-tap emojis. So today's talk then explores which foods are best for your brain. We know that what we eat affects our bodies, but did you know that foods you consume are also integral in determining whether your brain functions at its best as well? Well, prepare to make some additions then to your supermarket shopping list, because today we're going to learn which delicious foods can actually improve our brain power. Our wonderful speaker today is nutritional therapist Laura Southern. Now, Laura is passionate about the power of food to support our minds and bodies and runs a clinic called London Food Therapy, which helps clients with digestion, energy, sleep, weight, pain, and mood. Sounds like the whole package, doesn't it, really? So, Laura, hello and welcome to Saga Spaces. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm really well, Gavin. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, so am I as well. So before we dive into why you're so passionate about eating well for optimum brain health then, Laura, I'd love to know why you became a nutritionist in the first place.
Yeah, well, I became a nutritionist for my own health reasons. I have had eczema all my life since childhood and tried all the remedies from medical to Chinese herbs to homeopathy. And it was only in my kind of late teens, early 20s when I started changing and looking at my diet that I've really started seeing a huge difference and a huge improvement. And I was working at the time in my 20s in a really high-powered, stressful, but fun job, but loads of travel, late nights, and I kind of thought this isn't sustainable for me. So with my passion for nutrition that I'd learned by kind of healing my own body, I started learning more about it and then changed careers in my early 30s and have been doing nutrition and loving it ever since.
Oh, I love that. Sounds great. Inspirational. So now, Laura, I'd like to hand over to you, Laura Southern, for your Saga Spaces talk. How can we feed our brains better?
Do you ever find yourself walking into a room and forgetting what it was you went in for? What about looking for your keys only to find them in the fridge? Or perhaps like me, you bump into someone in the street and you literally can't remember their names. Well, these memory slips are all too common and they don't signify anything to worry about. But as we age, we can begin to worry that our brains aren't as sharp as they once were, and perhaps we think about worst case scenario. Well, the good news is that taking action and supporting our brain health now can actually help with this clarity of thought and maybe even improve our cognition. In this talk, I'm going to explain how we can build a brain-boosting diet. I'm going to teach you how to nourish our brains. We're going to learn about the power of antioxidants, the importance of healthy fats, and how drinks can even improve your focus. I'll talk to you about what tests to go and ask your doctor for, and you're going to learn about why metabolic health is so critical into protecting our brain. I'm hopeful that by the end of this talk, you'll have lots of takeaway tips so that you can start putting changes in place, and hopefully there'll be no more lost keys. Now, before we kind of think about the exact type of food that we need to eat for our brain, I think it's really useful to think about how our brain gets its fuel. So the brain's main fuel is glucose. So we get that by eating food. Very simply, we eat some food, we digest it, and the sugar from that food goes into our bloodstream. We call it blood sugar, blood glucose. That travels in our bloodstream to our brain. It gets through to our brain via a very kind of tightly packed group of cells who are very, very selective, very small gaps. They don't allow big particles in and they only allow small things out. And that's called the blood-brain barrier. Now, the blood-brain barrier is there to stop things like pathogens, toxins to get into our brain, and it allows things like oxygen and glucose to fuel our brain. Now, our brain has a really strong and big requirement for glucose, for energy. So despite its relatively small size in our body, it uses about 20 to 25% of our body's total glucose. We can think of our brain a little bit like the factory in our body. So our brain is the factory, our body is the city, and our brain is constantly manufacturing goods and sending them out to the city where they need to go. If there is a power cut, things don't happen as effectively. And if there are times when we are lacking in glucose, or perhaps the glucose can't get to where it needs to go, it's a little bit like having a power cut. Things start shutting down, the factory is not working as effectively, the city is suffering. So it's really important, I think, to think about our blood sugar balance and the level and the quality of the blood sugar that we're having in order to support our brain function. So picture a time when you've maybe had some really, really high sugar foods, or perhaps you've got grandchildren who go to a party and those kids, fill up on all the sugar and stuff, super high, and then they come crashing down an hour and a half later. Maybe they're having a tantrum. Perhaps you've had a really delicious piece of chocolate cake and suddenly an hour later you're slumped and you can't quite focus, or you just feel quite fatigued, or maybe you're really irritable. This can often be a consequence of a low blood sugar. So what happens is our blood sugar shoots up quite high because of the high sugar food, and our body has quite good processes at removing that sugar. We release insulin, and insulin packages up the sugar and moves it out of the bloodstream. If our insulin is working well, this can be too effective and we're left with a low blood sugar. And that's like this power cut analogy. Suddenly there isn't enough glucose to get to the brain and things shut down. We start to feel I can't say the word now myself. We start to feel a little bit muddled in our thinking. Maybe we haven't got pure clarity of thought. Probably we've got cravings. Now, this is something that actually our body can remedy quite well. And every now and then it doesn't really matter. But what can happen if you're constantly eating in a way that gives you high blood sugar is that actually you can cause quite a lot of damage to your brain and to your cognition over time. So if you are constantly eating in a way that's got lots and lots of sugar, perhaps you're often having, fizzy drinks with high sugar, or teas and coffees with lots of sugar, or perhaps the grains that you're choosing and the carbohydrates that you're choosing are very processed, which we'll talk about in a minute. The body has a very high level of sugar in it. Over time, the body keeps producing insulin to move the sugar from the blood into the cells or to store it as fat. But if there's high levels of insulin going on and high levels of sugar in the blood, the cells stop responding to insulin. They're a bit like, oh, insulin, you again? And they don't let the insulin and the sugar pass into the cells where they need to go. And this is damaging because what happens is our bloodstream remains high in glucose. And if this happens, this delicate blood-brain barrier that's got these very tight junctions that protects our brain, the sugar can start damaging those and it makes them more permeable. It allows pathogens, it allows inflammation to occur inside our brain. And this is extremely damaging. This is leading to things like Alzheimer's, dementia. And equally, if we're having high sugar in the blood, but also high insulin, this high insulin means that there's insulin resistance. And the insulin resistance means that the glucose, the fuel for our brain, can't travel where it needs to go. So that gives you that kind of hypoglycemia feeling that I was talking about before with the low blood sugar. And sadly, we know that people who have insulin resistance, people who have pre-diabetes, high blood sugar, type 1 and type 2 diabetes are at much, much higher risk of getting Alzheimer's and getting dementia. So the first thing when we're thinking about what to eat to support our brain health is actually all about supporting our metabolic health and supporting our blood sugar. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing actually isn't even about food. I will come on to food, I promise. But the first thing actually is about how we eat, how we structure our meals. Because when we're thinking about reducing our blood sugar and increasing our insulin sensitivity, we need to make sure that there's times of the day when we're not eating, when our blood sugar isn't elevated, when our insulin isn't elevated. So the best thing that we can start doing to support our brain health is to think about having an overnight fast. So what this means, fasting, intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, that's all the rage at the moment. But what it simply means is moving your eating window into a shorter space of time so that you've got a good 12 hours overnight where you're not consuming any food. Water would be fine. So for example, you might have your breakfast at 7 a.m. You might finish your evening meal by 7 p.m. And after that 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., there's no food going in. And this allows your body and your blood sugar to rebalance, to reset, to get your insulin sensitive again. If you're already struggling with blood sugar issues, which many of us are, then actually reducing that eating window to a smaller amount of time, perhaps 10 hours, so that you're eating maybe 8 a.m. and stopping at 6 p.m. will also be more effective. And you can even sometimes in the week squeeze that down a bit more. Now we are going to come on to food. So I mentioned quickly before that when we're thinking about some of the types of food that we could be eating that spikes our blood sugar, yes, we're probably all aware that, having high sugar food isn't going to be supportive for our blood sugar. But some of the carbohydrates, some of the grains that we might be choosing to eat in our diet can also impact negatively on our blood sugar. So the grains that are quite harmful are the refined, the processed grains. So I want you to think about a piece of wheat growing in a field. And I'm a very urban girl, so it's not my kind of natural habitat, but just kind of, bear with me and think about that little kind of kernel of wheat that you might get. There's an outer husk, an inner kind of kernel, which is a bit like a small nut. And when the food manufacturers want to make wheat into flour, they strip away that outer husk because that's fibrous and it kind of blocks the machines. And they remove the fat, which is there to give the wheat a chance to the energy to grow. They take that out because that can make the flour go quite rancid. And what you're then left with is this highly processed, highly refined flour, which is a brilliantly versatile commodity making bread and pasta and cakes and pastries. And when we eat that refined flour, it's like the food manufacturers have done the digesting for us. Our body can really easily extract the sugar from that food and it elevates our blood sugar quickly. Now, this might sound like a good thing. We don't have to work hard to process this food. But when it comes to our brain health, it gives us this high spike of blood sugar, this high insulin release, and then this potential long-term damage for our brain health. So what we're wanting to do is to switch these refined and processed carbohydrates to the whole grain form. And there have been some really positive studies showing that people who eat higher levels of whole grains actually have a reduced risk of Alzheimer's and dementia. So the study was actually published earlier this year and it followed 3,000 people over 12 years, so quite comprehensive. And it showed that people who ate more than 1.5 servings of whole grain foods every single day reduced their incidences or reduced their chances of dementia by 34% and reduced their chances of Alzheimer's by 40%. So 1.5 servings a day is very little. It's like maybe a bowl of porridge and perhaps switching white rice to brown rice. But I want you to do a whole lot more than that because these whole grains can be really, really supportive for us. So it's about thinking, well, I always buy supermarket bread. What can I do to change it up? Go to the local bakery, try and buy some bread made from rye flour or spelt flour, or look for one that says heritage grains or a good quality sourdough. These are all much, much higher in fibre, higher in whole grains than a supermarket loaf. So will support your blood sugar better. What about thinking, porridge for breakfast? Complete nutritionist cliche, but actually if you're going for porridge made from whole oats or steel cut oats, you're going to be getting whole grains versus kind of the packaged microwave oats, which are quite heavily processed and more likely to spike your blood sugar. And I also want you to utilize what's going on at the supermarkets right now. If you look in the sections where often they have the microwave rice, you'll see packets of things like quinoa and bulgur wheat and farro and spelt, all different grains that might be mixed up already with some rice or on their own, maybe with some lentils. And you can just chuck them in the microwave. And that is an amazing way of increasing your whole grains. You can add them to roasted vegetables, you have them as an accompaniment to meat or fish or as a salad for lunch. And it's a really easy way to support your brain health through supporting whole grains. So as well as fueling our brain with glucose, it's also really important to support the structure of our brain. So structurally, our brain is made from about 60% fat. And to support that, we need to make sure that we are consuming the right types of fat to give our brain that structural boost that it needs. And there are lots of studies to show that increasing unsaturated fats can support the integrity of our brain and our cognition. So the unsaturated fats are those kind of classic Mediterranean diet ones: olive oil, nuts, seeds, oily fish. And we probably all know, don't we? Oily fish, it gives you brains. It's quite interesting to know the reason why. So oily fish contains a substance which you, I'm sure, have heard of called omega-3. And omega-3 has a component in it called DHA. And that DHA is something that we need in our brain. our grey matter is made up of 90% DHA. And it's very normal to lose some grey matter as we age, and we're kind of always losing a little bit from about kind of 40 plus. But too much is implicated in things like Parkinson's, in Alzheimer's. And the grey matter is that really important brainy part of ours that controls our speech, our learning, our memory, our cognition. So it's really vital that we are constantly trying to support the structure of the grey matter. We're constantly wanting to top it up. And the best way to do that is to consume small oily fish, maybe 2, maybe 3 times a week. So the small oily fish I'm talking about are things like sardines and anchovies, mackerel, herring. Really simple. You can just have them in their tins, keep them in the cupboard, stick them on some good quality rye bread for breakfast, perhaps have them with a salad as lunch. If you're going to a restaurant, or if you're on holiday, get someone else to cook them. Really great chance to kind of include some fish that you might not necessarily eat. As well as increasing unsaturated fat from the oily fish, it's also really helpful to include these unsaturated oils from nuts. So walnuts are a great one to think about. If you picture a walnut, it looks a little bit like a brain. And there have been some studies, again, showing that increasing walnut consumption can decrease the risk of cognitive decline. So there was a study done several years ago, over 2 years, and it was called the Walnut and Healthy Aging Study, or WAHA for short. In the study, they split the participants into 2 groups. One didn't eat any walnuts. The other group had the equivalent of about 14 walnuts every single day for 2 years. And once the trial was over, it found that people who were eating the walnuts were less likely to have cognition problems post the trial. So it's a really easy addition to make to your diet because walnuts are tasty. You can chuck them into things like yogurts and porridge at breakfast. You can put them into salads or chop them up and even sprinkle them on soup. If you're a baker, you can bake and put them into breads, put them into cakes. And again, when we're thinking about nuts, trying to go for unsalted raw nuts, things like pecans, almonds, hazelnuts, all of those are going to be brain supportive because they're going to give you these unsaturated structural fats. Olive oil, when we're thinking about the Mediterranean diet, you kind of can't not think about olive oil. And that is also absolutely critical for our brain health. And again, lots of studies to show that not only olive oil doesn't only support our brain health, but it can actually, in a very, very small study, it was shown increasing olive oil consumption daily can reverse cognitive decline. So that's amazing for someone that's already feeling, I'm worried about my brain health. Just increasing your olive oil or introducing olive oil might help. And it has been shown as well in other studies to reduce markers of Alzheimer's in the blood. So when we're thinking about olive oil, make it enjoyable. I've just come back from a couple of weeks in Spain on my holidays, and every time you go to a restaurant, you're given bread and there's no butter, you dunk it in olive oil. I mean, do that at home, pretend you're on holiday, how nice. But also you can drizzle it on salads, you can put it on top of soups, you can make sauces out of it. And what you're wanting to do is find good quality, extra virgin olive oil and go quite heavy. No worries about kind of calorie levels. I don't want you worrying about that. Thinking about a tablespoon, maybe even 2 a day. So structurally, I've mentioned that our brain is made from fat, but also the other component, which is critical as we age, is protein. Now, protein is so essential to our brain because it is the structural component of our neurotransmitters. So our neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers that our brain produces that get sent round our body to control everything from our heartbeat to our breathing, to our learning, to our concentration, to our mood. You've probably heard of mood neurotransmitters like serotonin, like dopamine. And we need a different variety of proteins to be able to manufacture and synthesize all of these different neurotransmitters. Also, when we're thinking about wear and tear of our body and of our brain, protein is what our body uses to rebuild. So if there's a lack of protein in your diet, then the actual structure can suffer and perhaps you're not kind of having that regrowth that is so essential. Protein is it's been a buzzword in nutrition marketing for several years now, and that means you can't escape any packaging saying added protein, protein this, protein that. I'm not a big believer in going for protein shakes and protein bars and protein this and protein that, unless you've been advised to by a healthcare professional. Generally, if you are eating a kind of whole food, largely unprocessed diet, you'll be getting enough protein to meet your needs, because every food that has ever lived, be it animal or plant, will contain protein. But what's kind of vital is just trying to get that variety of protein, because each protein kind of contains different structures that can make our neurotransmitters, make our brain cells in different ways. So we're thinking about building in protein at each meal. So perhaps breakfast, you might be putting in some ground flax seeds, maybe those walnuts that we discussed, possibly putting those into a yogurt, a really nice, rich protein breakfast. Lunch, you might be going for lots of vegetarian proteins. Perhaps there's a lentil and barley soup, or maybe it's chickpeas or falafel and hummus salad. Maybe dinner might be some meat or some fish, or maybe a stir fry with tofu and cashew nuts. If you're going for snacks, a really lovely protein snack would just be some crackers with almond butter or peanut butter on them. So there's loads of ways to build in really supportive protein foods to support your brain health and support your blood sugar, because when we're eating protein, it doesn't release its sugars quickly, keeps us fuller for longer. So therefore, you won't be getting these blood sugar spikes, which are so damaging. Now, when we're thinking about protein, carbohydrate, fat, we're talking about our macronutrients. But there's also micronutrients, the small vitamins and minerals that are so key to our brain health as well. And I'm going to just touch upon a few here. And the ones I've chosen are the ones that actually you can go today or tomorrow to your GP and ask to get checked, because these are all tested on the NHS. And all of these, if you are deficient, can have a huge impact on your brain health. And if you are deficient and you get your levels back to optimum, you can start to feel better, sharper, more focused. So that's a really critical thing. So the first one we'll discuss is B12. It's absolutely critical for our brain health. And in fact, it's very, very common to be deficient. 1 in 20 people over 60 and 1 in 10 people over 75 in the UK are thought to be deficient in B12. And this matters when we're thinking about our brain health, because the symptoms include brain fog, memory loss, fatigue, confusion, blurry vision, anxiety, depression. If you're suffering with any of those symptoms and you don't know why, you're going to start panicking and thinking, what's wrong? What's going on with my brain? Go to the GP. Maybe it's B12 deficiency. You can get that corrected very easily with the right supplementation. Again, vitamin D, very, very common to be deficient in vitamin D. About 90% of the UK population are deficient in vitamin D. And it's because we don't really get it very easily from our food. We get it from the sun, only when we have a good summer, and only between certain months, about March to September, if the sun is shining and if the sun is in the right place and if you are exposing yourself. So it's very, very common to be deficient. And if you are deficient in vitamin D, it can lead to brain issues, things like brain fog, depression. Low levels of vitamin D are implicated in most autoimmune conditions, including multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease. So again, getting that checked at the GP, really important. Iron is also one that your GP will happily check. And again, if your iron is low, if you are anemic, that will stop the oxygen transport to your brain. So it's kind of like, again, another kind of power switch being switched off. You're going to become more confused. You're going to have foggy thinking, losing that clarity of thought. And once you're there, once you're requesting a blood test from your GP, get them to check your thyroid. Because if your thyroid is underactive, or perhaps like me, you have an underactive thyroid and you're not always, having the correct level of medication, you'll also notice that you can't sometimes string sentences together. You're losing your thought. You're losing your train of thought. You're very, very fatigued. It sometimes feels like you're walking through treacle. So all of these things, whilst none of them are nice, if it's because of the deficiency, you can get these corrected. Now, I want to talk about a really exciting area in brain health, because I think most of us probably believe that it's very normal to lose some memory as we age, and that brain shrinkage is kind of inevitable as we get older. And actually, this is what scientists used to believe. But we now know that this is kind of not correct. And science has found that our body is able to generate a type of protein that can actually help grow our brain cells, can help protect our brain cells. And it's almost a little bit like a fertilizer for the brain. It helps grow new brain connections and even grow the size and increase the size of our grey matter. So this substance is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. I'm not going to say it again because it's such a mouthful, but we call it BDNF. And we are able to manufacture it ourselves. So studies have shown that people in their 80s and in their 90s can manufacture BDNF, increase the size of their hippocampus, increase their reaction time. The most way it's been studied is through exercise, which we're not going to talk about for me in this talk, but there are also certain foods that can increase this brain fertilizer, that can increase this BDNF. And luckily, the foods that can increase it are actually all delicious and all lovely and all things that you're probably consuming, but you can consume more because it's found mainly in fruits and vegetables. So when we are thinking about increasing our BDNF, we are wanting to increase fruits and vegetables that give us antioxidant properties. So I want you to imagine you've picked up a ripe peach and you cut it on a plate and it's so ripe and juicy that it almost kind of bleeds, it stains your plate. Or perhaps, you're cutting beetroot and your fingers are all stained, and maybe you've picked up a peach or a tomato and the smell is like so evocative and strong that it's kind of taking you back to somewhere else and transporting you. That is a sign that this produce is really, really high in things like polyphenols, flavonoids, these plant compounds that give our body these antioxidant properties. Now, our brains are constantly on an onslaught from when we're in childhood, constantly under onslaught from things like pollution, from toxins, from the environment, from what we're putting inside our bodies in terms of smoking, alcohol, sugar, medication. And our brains need to defend themselves. And the best way that they can defend themselves is by having this kind of army of fruit and vegetable antioxidants. And when it comes to this brain fertilizer, this BDNF, we know that the more antioxidant protection we have in our brain, the more BDNF we can generate. So it makes sense to really focus on what can I add into my diet that is bright, that is colorful, that smells good, that tastes good, but is natural. So I'm talking about, great if you have some blueberries for breakfast in the morning, that is wonderful. But what else? Can you have some cherries, some blackberries, some blackcurrants, some raspberries, some red currants, pomegranates, all of those deep, rich purples and reds? What about lunch? Maybe you're having a bit of lettuce with your salad. Brilliant. But what else? Let's bring those dark greens in there, some kale and spinach and watercress and fresh basil and fresh coriander. Maybe dinner is some soup. Lovely. Bring some orange veg in there. Can it be butternut squash or pumpkin, sweet potato? All of those colours, all of those different varieties across a week are going to increase your antioxidant properties. And I don't want you to forget about spices and herbs, because sometimes when we think about more of a natural plant and whole food diet, people start thinking, well, that's boring. Where's the flavour? But the spices and the herbs are what brings the flavour, but also gives you these antioxidant properties in mega doses. So we're thinking about the kind of orange warming spices to support our brain health. Turmeric, saffron, paprika, cardamom, ginger, all of these give you flavour, but they will also support your brain health. When it comes to antioxidants, tea and coffee are also really rich, and I'm going to discuss those in a minute. But before we talk about those, I'm just going to touch very quickly on the most important drink for us all, which is water. Now, water is one of these things that we probably all know we need to drink, but it is absolutely vital to our clarity of thinking because we are often mildly dehydrated. So the studies say that most people are roughly 1 to 2% dehydrated at any one time. And if you think back to an afternoon when maybe you've just sat down in front of the TV to watch a quiz show and suddenly you're asleep, or maybe you've got that kind of 3-4 o'clock slump and all you can think about is maybe having, a cup of coffee and some chocolate to kind of boost you up. Often it's actually a sign of dehydration. And water is used by the brain to communicate and as channels to send the nutrition around different brain cells, but also to remove toxins. So if there's not enough water going around, you're going to lose that clarity of thought. You're going to feel muddled. You're going to feel tired. Again, you might feel irritable. So it's really important to drink. Now, as we age, from about the age of 50, we start to lose that signal, that thirst signal. So that message that we need to drink starts going away. So it's very common to become dehydrated as we get older. So it's important to just think about drinking, but you can also do a test on your own body to see if you're dehydrated. So you can pinch the back of your hand like this, and it should, hopefully the skin should drop down quickly. If that happens, and mine did luckily, generally that's a sign that you're hydrated enough. You also, if you haven't got any medical conditions, want to be urinating every 2 to 3 hours. And those are signs that actually you probably have enough water. So I wanted to talk about tea and coffee before we finish, because I think those are drinks that many of us consume on a regular basis. I know I do, I'm a big fan. And what's interesting about them is that they are actually classed as a part of this kind of new research that's going on into something called nootropics or smart drugs. So supplement companies and pharmaceutical companies are investing huge amounts of research into an area called nootropics or smart drugs. And these are medications and supplements that have been shown to kind of activate your memory, activate your learning. They seem to work by improving both oxygen and glucose to our brain. And this is kind of new research, but what we have in our home that many of us are regularly consuming is access to these nootropics, to these smart drugs, because caffeine is one. So if you're anything like me and you have not yet had your first cup of coffee, and then you reach for your first cup of coffee and you have your drink, and you'll suddenly be like, mentally alert, and you can focus and you can go and conquer the world on that one cup of coffee. That is the power of these nootropics that they're having. So I'm all for you drinking a cup of coffee or a cup of tea to get that caffeine boost. Because actually there's quite a lot of evidence to show that caffeine is neuroprotective. It might, in certain cases, reduce the risk of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. And that could be to do with this nootropics, or it might be also, or probably both, to do with the antioxidant quality of the coffee. Now, quality does count, so you have to become a little bit of a coffee snob. I'm not really talking about kind of, maybe a very, very cheap instant coffee, although you will get some benefits from the caffeine, but to get the best protection, you're wanting to kind of get some ground beans or go to a coffee shop and get one of, their ground beans, but not getting it filled up with sugars and syrups and creams, because that is then going to have a negative impact on your blood sugar. And it's also just important to think about timing, because sleep is absolutely critical for our brain health. And if we are not sleeping well because of the caffeine, that's going to have a negative impact. So just making sure you're having your caffeine early in the day, maybe before lunch. And when it comes to tea, there's also an amino acid in tea called L-theanine, which again is one of these nootropics. And it seems to give a very kind of calming and mood stabilizing effect. So that's something that might be nice to include as well. So we've reached the end of my talk. And I just want to kind of give you a few action points just before we finish. The first and most critical thing that I think that you can do for your brain health is to support your blood sugar. If that is supported, then that is the biggest step that you can make. So trying to eat in this 12, but maybe even 10-hour window, you're also then wanting to reduce your sugar consumption and reduce refined grains, replacing those with whole grain, and then protein to stabilize your blood sugar and to be able to create these neurotransmitters. Do not be afraid to visit your GP and get your B12, your vitamin D, your iron, and your thyroid checked. But then really it's just the fun stuff. Maximize your intake of brightly coloured fruits and veg. Enjoy your food, get taste, get flavour, but keep it kind of unprocessed and as natural as possible. Don't forget to drink water, maybe a cup or two of tea or coffee daily. And really just try and enjoy your food. Think about what you can add in every single day to maximise those supportive nutrients. So thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed listening to my talk today.